There's a specific kind of frustration that's unique to the modern Australian experience. It isn't the gridlock traffic on the M1, and it isn't the exorbitant price of a CBD coffee. It's the sinking, hollow feeling you get when you look at your phone, see 4 bars of 5G reception, and realize that absolutely nothing is loading. For the better part of 30 years, Optus pitched itself as the antidote to this feeling. They were the yes team. In a market dominated by the monolithic, bureaucratic arrogance of Telstra, Optus was the plucky challenger. They were vibrant, yellow-branded, and optimistic. They promised to be cheaper, friendlier, and more innovative. They built an entire corporate identity on the idea that they were the people's telco, the ones who would keep you connected when the big guys let you down. But if you look at the last 3 years, that brand promise has been systematically dismantled, incinerated, and buried under a mountain of regulatory fines, parliamentary inquiries, and public apologies. Today, Optus is no longer the challenger. It's a cautionary tale of corporate fragility. It's a case study in what happens when a critical infrastructure provider forgets that its primary product is trust. Consider the sheer density of the timeline. In just 36 months, this single company has managed to expose the private identification data of nearly half the Australian population, suffer a catastrophic nationwide blackout that left hospitals and trains stranded, and unknowingly facilitate a fatal failure of the 000 emergency network. So, how does a critical infrastructure provider, a company that in some way holds the digital keys to the nation, get it so wrong so many times in such rapid succession? Is this just a run of historic bad luck, or is it evidence of a deep, systemic rot within the culture of Australia's second largest telco? To understand the magnitude of the collapse, we first have to appreciate the height of the pedestal Optus placed itself on. By 2022, Optus was flying relatively high. They were aggressive in the market, they'd secured the exclusive rights to the English Premier League, and they were pushing a narrative of being a technology-led company. They were selling the future. Then, on September 22nd, the future collapsed. Optus announced they'd been the victim of a cyber attack. As the details trickled out, the numbers became staggering. The personal data of up to 10 million Australians had been accessed. Almost immediately, the corporate spin machine kicked into high gear. Optus CEO Kelly Bayer-Rosmarin appeared in the media looking somber and described the attack as sophisticated. She painted a picture of a relentless high-tech assault by master criminals who had tunneled through their defenses. She invoked the image of a company under siege, fighting a war against the dark web's elite. The reality, however, was embarrassingly, negligently simple. The hack didn't involve complex encryption cracking. It didn't involve zero-day exploits or state-sponsored espionage tools. It involved an API endpoint, api.optus.com.au, that had been left wide open on the internet. It didn't require a password. It didn't require authentication tokens. Anyone who found the address could simply request the customer data, and the system would hand it over. But the negligence went even deeper. The records were sequential. If you changed the customer ID number in the URL by 1 digit, the system gave you the next person's data. The hacker didn't need to be a genius, they just needed to write a basic script to ask for every single record, one by one, until they had millions of them. When the government looked at the forensics, they were furious. Minister for Home Affairs, Claire O'Neill, publicly contradicted the CEO, stating that the attack wasn't sophisticated and that Optus had essentially left the window open. What followed was, according to the ABC, a week of hell. For days, millions of customers had no idea if they were affected. People were refreshing their emails, waiting for a notification that didn't come. The void of information was filled by panic. Were our bank accounts safe? Did we need to cancel our passports? Then came the extortion. A user on a dark web forum claiming to be the hacker released a sample of the records to prove they were serious. They demanded a ransom of $1 million USD to delete the rest. The release of those records turned into a national emergency as state governments had to scramble to figure out how to reissue millions of driver's licenses. The federal government had to rewrite regulations on the fly to allow Optus to share data with banks to prevent fraud, something that privacy laws previously prevented. The hacker eventually panicked, claiming they'd deleted the data and apologizing for the attention, likely realizing they'd drawn the heat of the Australian Federal Police and the FBI. But the damage was done. The Office of the Australian Information Commissioner launched a massive investigation, taking civil penalty action that could result in fines stretching into the millions. The ACMA also moved to prosecute. This event changed the landscape of Australian privacy law forever. It forced the government to increase penalties for data breaches from a manageable $2.2 million to a terrifying $50 million or more. It was a wake-up call that cost Optus tens of millions in replacement document fees and independent reviews. But for Optus, this was just the first domino. While they were busy apologizing for 2022, the infrastructure itself was beginning to crack. On November 8, 2023, at 4:05 AM, the network simply died. 10 million mobile and broadband services went dark. The scale of the disruption was something Australia hadn't seen before. The digital arteries of the nation were severed. Trains in Melbourne stopped running because the drivers couldn't communicate with control centres. Hospitals couldn't contact on-call doctors. Small businesses watched their EFTPOS terminals display connection error for an entire trading day. The gig economy froze. Uber drivers, delivery riders, and freelancers were instantly unemployed for the day. So what happened? Was it a massive cyber attack? No, it was a routing error. The outage was triggered by a routine software upgrade from an international peering network. Optus routers received changes to routing information that exceeded their present safety levels. To simplify the technical jargon, the routers got flooded with too much routing data. Instead of slowing down or rejecting the bad data, the routers entered a self-protection mode. They effectively committed suicide to save themselves, disconnecting from the core network. It was a domino effect. One router went down, putting more load on the others, which then also went down. Within minutes, the entire IP core network had isolated itself. The restoration process was archaic. Because the management network was also down, meaning the tool engineers used to fix the network was also running on the network that was broken, Optus engineers couldn't remotely fix the issue. They had to physically drive to 14 different sites across the country to manually reboot the system. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar tech company relying on people driving vans to plug things in and turn them off and on again. But while the engineers were driving to the sites, the leadership was nowhere to be found. For nearly 7 hours, there was radio silence. CEO Kelly Bayer Rosmarin eventually appeared on the radio to offer defensive, contradictory statements. She initially downplayed the severity, then blamed third parties, then admitted she didn't know the cause. The week of hell from 2022 felt like a dress rehearsal for this. The inability to communicate with 10 million customers during a crisis exposed a lack of basic redundancy in their crisis management protocols. The fallout was immediate. The ACMA later slammed Optus with a $12 million penalty specifically for the failure to manage this problem. The Department of Infrastructure launched a post-incident review which tore apart Optus's technical management and lack of oversight. Ultimately, the buck had to stop somewhere. Kelly Bayer Rosmarin, who had tried to weather the data breach storm, couldn't survive the blackout. Following a disastrous appearance at a Senate inquiry where she struggled to explain the failure, she resigned, stating it was in the best interest of Optus. She left a company with a shattered reputation and a customer base that was rapidly porting their numbers to Telstra and Vodafone. But unfortunately, the worst was yet to come. By 2025, the narrative was supposed to be about recovery. Optus had a new leadership team, a new customer focus, and a public commitment to rebuilding the trust that had been incinerated over the previous 2 years. They were meant to be the safe pair of hands again. They promised that the lessons of the blackout had been learned. Then came September 18th, 2025. Another outage, but this one was more insidious than the total blackout of 2023. It was a specific, invisible failure of the most critical line of defense in the country, the 000 interconnect. For around 13 hours, hundreds of people trying to call for ambulances, police, or fire brigades on the Optus network were met with silence, congestion tones, or failed connections. The cause was a quote, routine firewall upgrade gone wrong. Once again, a standard maintenance procedure, something that should be the bread and butter of a telecommunications giant, triggered a catastrophic failure. The upgrade inadvertently disconnected the IP core network from the 000 trunk. But unlike 2023, where the network was visibly dead, this was different. Users had bars of service. They could check Instagram, they could call their friends. They just couldn't call for help if they needed an ambulance or a fire truck. The technical failure was compounded by a breakdown in inter-carrier communication that borders on negligence. During the crisis, Optus provided limited information to Telstra. But because Optus failed to adequately communicate the nature and scale of the fault, Telstra couldn't prepare to catch the calls. This time, the cost was measured in human lives. The outage has been linked to multiple deaths where families were unable to reach emergency services in time. The government had had enough by this point. The ACMA introduced tough new rules requiring telcos to check on the welfare of customers during outages and better manage the emergency call system, explicitly stating that the status quo is not an option. While the outages and data breaches painted a picture of a company that was technically incompetent, a parallel legal battle revealed something far darker, a company that was culturally predatory. It's one thing to be bad at your job, and it's another thing to be actively malicious. In 2024, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission dragged Optus to the federal court. The allegations were damning. Between 2019 and 2023, the exact period they were struggling to keep their network online, Optus staff had engaged in unconscionable conduct, targeting some of the most vulnerable people in Australian society. We're talking about sales staff targeting people with intellectual disabilities, people with cognitive impairments, and people who lived in remote areas with absolutely no Optus coverage. The ACCC found that staff, driven by aggressive sales targets and ruthless clawback policies where they lost commissions if they didn't hit targets, sold expensive phones and accessories to people who clearly didn't understand what they were signing. In one heartbreaking case detailed by financial counselors, a person with a severe intellectual disability was sold multiple contracts they didn't need and couldn't use, racking up thousands of dollars in debt. When the families tried to cancel these contracts, Optus handed the debts over to collectors who hounded these vulnerable families for money they didn't have. The system was rigged to exploit the people who most needed protection. The federal court didn't mince words. In September 2025, Justice O'Sullivan ordered Optus to pay a $100 million penalty, finding that the conduct was unconscionable and that senior management knew or ought to have known about the system failures that allowed it to happen. And it didn't stop there. Around the same time, Optus was hit with another fine, $826,000, for failing to prevent identity theft in their mobile porting process. Scammers had exploited a vulnerability in Optus's verification software to steal $39,000 from customers. When you take the technical failures and combine them with the ethical failures, you see a pattern. A company that cut corners on maintenance to save money and cut corners on ethics to make money. When you look at this litany of failures, you have to ask, who's flying the plane? In 2022, shortly before the chaos truly began, Optus made a high-profile hire that baffled many observers. They appointed former New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian to a senior executive role. On paper, hiring a former Premier brings government connections and prestige, but there was a massive, glowing red flag. Berejiklian was, at that very moment, under active investigation by the Independent Commission Against Corruption. For a company that relies on public trust, hiring an executive who was the subject of a corruption inquiry raised massive governance questions. It suggested a boardroom that was disconnected from the reality of public perception. It was a gamble that didn't pay off. In 2023, ICAC released its findings, declaring that Berejiklian had indeed engaged in serious corrupt conduct during her time as Premier. While she wasn't criminally charged, the optics of corruption stuck to Optus like tar. It reinforced the narrative that the company's leadership had a blind spot when it came to integrity. And looming over all of this is Singtel. The Singaporean telecommunications giant has owned Optus since 2001. For years, Optus was the jewel in their crown, a reliable cash cow in a stable Australian market. But by 2024, that relationship had soured. The Optus drag was pulling down Singtel's overall performance. In their 2024 annual report, Singtel had to repeatedly address the provision for penalties and the reputational damage caused by their Australian subsidiary. The financial results were grim reading. While they tried to spin a narrative of resilience, the reality was a balance sheet bleeding from legal costs, redundancy programs, and the sheer expense of trying to fix a broken network. Rumors began to swirl that Singtel wanted out. Talks of selling Optus to private equity or Brookfield surfaced, only to fall apart. Singtel is now effectively stuck with a distressed asset. They have to pour billions into fixing the network and paying fines, knowing that the brand value has been decimated. So, where does Optus stand today? It exists in a state of corporate purgatory. The Yes brand, once a symbol of optimism and competition, is now associated with failure. They've apologized, they've paid the fines, and they've replaced the CEO, but the structural issues, the fragility of the network, the aggressive sales culture, the questionable governance, take years to fix. The tragedy of Optus is that Australia needs them. We need a strong second player to keep Telstra honest. We need competition, but competition requires competence. And right now, Optus is fighting a war on 3 fronts. They're fighting their own infrastructure, they're fighting the regulators, and most difficult of all, they're fighting to regain the trust of a public that has been burned 3 times in 3 years. Optus has a long road back, and until they can prove that a routine upgrade won't crash the country, the only answer many Australians will have for them is no. But what do you think? Has Optus done enough to earn a second chance, or is the damage to their reputation permanent? Have you switched providers since the 2023 outage, or are you sticking with them hoping things improve? Let us know your thoughts and your own horror stories in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Anyways guys, thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay curious.